Well, Governor Kim Reynolds will deliver the Republican rebuttal to President Biden's State of the Union address tonight. Republicans hope to capitalize on the president's low approval ratings, shifting COVID policies, inflation, and the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. President Biden's speech comes as Democratic lawmakers, and they'll tell you this in private, face dim prospects in the upcoming midterm elections. Joining me now is Jeff Roe. Jeff was the chief strategist for Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin during his last campaign. He is also the founder of the Republican campaign firm Axiom Strategies. So, Jeff, has the political environment that you encountered in Virginia's governor's race, where basically Democratic advantages from just a year before essentially vanished, have those forces, that atmosphere, migrated to the rest of the country?
It has. In fact, it's about twice as bad as it was on election night in November in Virginia. We actually had a question that we added to every survey that tested Biden versus Trump again, a rerun. And of course, in the November election in 2020, he lost by 10 points. On election night, Biden would have beaten Trump in Virginia by about 3. Today, literally today, survey research we got back this morning, Trump would beat Biden by 7. So if you think about that, that's a 17-point net swing from just simply, 14 months ago. So it's a momentous movement that we've seen, and that's spanned the entire country, seen the same results.
And based on your experience, Jeff, and it's certainly something I've kept track of over the years, Virginia, and as it moves, can be an indicator of national trends.
It can. One of the things that I think the president's really saddled with is that at no time in the last 71 years of public polling has any president improved their approval rating within the midterm year. And so since January 31st, and he is at a historic low for Democrats. There's only been 2 Democrats in the last century that have fallen below 50% approval rating at this point in their presidency, and it's he and Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter looks like a giant compared to Biden. Jimmy Carter was at 49%. Most of Biden's numbers are 41, 42, or 43. So he's in a terrible political predicament.
Of course, former President Trump wants to play a big role in these midterms. Can he? Should he? And what did you learn from that, let us be honest, delicate dance in the Youngkin race?
Sure. I think that President Trump provides energy for Republicans, and off-year elections have a sliver of the turnout that a presidential election has. And so he can provide real opportunities for us to motivate our base, to motivate those voters that have buyer's remorse over the Biden presidency. Like I said, if Trump is winning by 7 against Biden in a rerun 14 months later, then he is not any drag on the ticket. In fact, he's an accelerant. And we saw in Virginia, in many parts of the Commonwealth, where we outperformed any historic numbers for an off-year election, and in fact rivaled his own numbers, and in a few examples exceeded his numbers. So he's an accelerant on a fire that's already burning, which is the Biden presidency, and he can be a big help in the midterms.
Jeff, let's talk real numbers. Plenty of Republicans I talked to imagine gaining 30 seats in the midterms. Some even talk of gaining 50 or 60 seats. Do you see that? And nearby that question, do you have any fears that Republicans might be overestimating their prospects?
Well, the Democrats have done a really good job on redistricting this year, so I don't think we have that many seats in play. But this is what I will say from a numeric perspective, is there are 40 seats that are Democrat plus 5 advantage. In this environment, when we woke up this morning to a Republican 10.6 advantage, all those seats are way in play, and that's probably our target field. Now, there's 22 more seats that are D plus 5, but redistricting has not occurred. So we don't know exactly how they're going to play out, but just give us half of those. I mean, you're looking at a situation where there could be 50 seats in play. Now, that doesn't take into account Democrats and their strengths candidate by candidate, but just by the generic wave elections happen in off-year and midterm elections, and take the redistricting out of it, there should be 50 seats that will be in play. They're Democrat plus 5 seats that have a Democrat incumbent or open seat for us to compete in. And if you're talking about 50 seats, that's playing way side of their 50-yard line. Those are enormous numbers, particularly as we get into a balkanized time in American political history where people just have their jerseys on, red or blue, and they're going to vote for their own party. So I think we could be looking at a 30 to 50 seats is probably the window.
And Jeff, as you well know, if it's a wave election, there are often races not projected that pop up and land in that wave category.
There are, and it's not just because the political predicament of the Biden administration, but it's also the issue set that people care about. Normally, as Republicans, we kind of have to make up a few issues to get people to get excited about voting for us. We have to change the topic on occasion. But right now, at this moment, the reason why I think the Democrats are in real peril is because inflation is the #1 issue. Inflation wasn't a top 30 issue 14 months ago. And so they completely ascribe the peril of inflation and the impact on working families to the Democrats. Crime is a major issue. Immigration is a major issue. And yes, even education has become a major issue because of the woke factor and impact on education. And so the issue set that we can't swing a dead cat around it without hitting an issue that's great for us to campaign on and an issue that voters actually care about in their daily life.
I'll leave the dead cat swinging to you, Jeff, but it's State of the Union tonight. As a Republican strategist, watching the terrain and knowing that any incumbent president is going to try to maximize that moment, what issues do you believe President Biden should take head on, but as a Republican strategist, you hope he doesn't?
Yeah, well said. I will have the trash can really close to throw up in case he does. You know, if I was him, I would take masks off planes. If I was him, I'd ban Russian oil being sold in the United States. If I was him, I would talk about Tomahawk and Stinger missiles that they're going to sell Ukraine. I mean, those are big opportunity issues that are going to make news. I'd think about even reopening the Keystone Pipeline. I think there's an opportunity for a reset. This is one of the few moments he'll have between now and Election Day to actually change the narrative of his candidacy, to go back to the old, Uncle Joe Biden from Delaware, the mainstream, moderate Democrat. I don't think they have it in them. I'll have my trash can really close to me in case they do. But if they did things like that, took big steps on COVID to release the country from some of these confines that the pandemic has put upon us and Democratic administrations put on us, to actually go in and truly impact Ukraine, to do some things along the lines of reestablishing opportunities for inflation to come down with oil prices, that would be a great reset for him. I don't know if they have it in them. They've got a big progressive night. We have an election here in Texas tonight that's going to have, battling within their party between moderates and progressives. And I think that continually puts them in turmoil. And so I don't know if he can get it done, but if he does that tonight, it would be a big win.
Jeff, the Republican Party is not without some of its own issues of turmoil. To what degree, from your vantage point, have divisions that have popped up recently within the Republican Party over Russia and Ukraine weakened its standing?
Well, I don't think so. There's a mainline philosophy around Ukraine with the Republican Party, and there's a mainline positions on both these issues that Republicans ascribe to. You're going to have some splinters on both sides of the political ledger, but I think uniformly Republicans believe that we need to arm the Ukrainian military. We need to send every single item that we can to them to help fight off Russia and Putin. And I think there's widespread agreement. Of course, there's some people that are outliers within the party on that topic, but it's pretty clear that this is a rallying of the world against Putin and his aggression, and almost all Republicans fall right into that bucket.
And real quick, Jeff, the Republican position mainline is not that Vladimir Putin is a genius, correct?
It's not. That's not where the Republican Party is. Republicans have fighting from the Cold War on. We know that Russia and China are main aggressors and our main competition worldwide. One we compete with economically, one we need to be prepared for militarily. And so I think we all view that way.
Jeff Roe, coming to us from Houston. Thanks so very much.